Jerome Powell just issued a public warning that should stop every working American in their tracks. Standing at Harvard University, the Federal Reserve Chair looked directly at his audience and said, "It will not end well if we don't do something fairly soon." He wasn't talking about a foreign war. He wasn't talking about a stock market correction. He was talking about your money, your mortgage, your grocery bill, and the $39 trillion debt that is quietly dismantling the American middle class 1 month at a time. Stay with me because the math I'm about to show you will permanently change how you see your financial future. Subscribe right now. This channel publishes financial analysis daily, connecting the decisions made in Washington directly to what happens inside your household budget. Here is what most people don't understand. The Federal Reserve just held interest rates for the third consecutive time. And the reason isn't what the headlines are saying. The Fed isn't holding because the economy is strong. It's holding because it is mathematically trapped. Inflation is running at 3.3%, the highest in nearly 2 years. The Iran conflict is pushing energy costs higher every week. Tariffs are feeding directly into the price of groceries, electronics, and building materials. And yet the Fed cannot raise rates to fight that inflation. Because at $39 trillion in debt, if rates climbed aggressively the way they did in 1980 under Paul Volcker, the annual interest bill on that debt would approach $2.3 trillion. That number is not an abstraction. That is nearly every single dollar of individual income tax revenue the federal government collects, consumed entirely by interest payments before a single dollar goes to defense, healthcare, infrastructure, or anything else. The Volcker solution, which broke inflation in 1980, is mathematically off the table in 2026. And here is the question that should be keeping you up at night. If the Fed can't raise rates, can it at least cut them and give American households some relief? The answer, confirmed in writing by the International Monetary Fund just days ago, is no. Drop a comment right now. Tell me whether you think there is any path out of this trap or whether the middle class pays the price for the next decade. The IMF completed its formal 2026 review of the United States economy and stated explicitly that with the policy rate close to neutral, there is little room to cut interest rates this year, particularly given rising energy costs and tariff pass-through into core inflation. The organization that manages sovereign debt crises around the world looked at America's books and told the Fed directly that it cannot cut. Deutsche Bank analysts published a formal research note confirming fiscal dominance, the technical term for what happens when government debt becomes so large that it constrains the central bank's ability to fight inflation. In a fiscal dominance regime, the Fed cannot hike without triggering a debt spiral and cannot cut without reigniting inflation. It can only hold. And while it holds, something else happens. The middle class pays. Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund, stated publicly this week that the United States is already in stagflation. Apollo's chief economist confirmed it. Stanford's Economic Policy Institute called stagflation the dominant risk for 2026. KPMG's chief economist noted that consumer concern about both inflation and the labor market moved up simultaneously for the first time since the 1970s. Slow growth, persistent inflation, rising unemployment risk. The policy nightmare where every tool the Fed reaches for makes at least one problem dramatically worse. Now here's the number that every American household needs to see clearly, because this is not a debate about macroeconomics. This is arithmetic about your life. The Yale Budget Lab modeled what a permanent 1% of GDP increase in federal spending does to the average American household. Just 1%, smaller than what Washington is currently running. The result is a cumulative loss of $16,000 in household purchasing power over 30 years. Mortgage rates rise by nearly a full percentage point, adding $2,300 to $2,500 more per year to the average family's mortgage payment. Real household wealth declines by $24,000 to $36,000 per household over 3 decades from that single channel alone. The U.S. deficit is currently running at 6 to 7% of GDP, 6 to 7 times the 1% scenario Yale modeled. The math is not complicated. The wealth destruction embedded in the current fiscal path is not $16,000 per household. It is a multiple of that number. And it doesn't arrive like a crash that gets news coverage and triggers a government response. It arrives in a mortgage rate that never quite comes down, in a grocery bill that never quite returns to what it was, in a raise that is always just slightly smaller than the price increase that arrived before it. Former Federal Reserve Chair and former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said it without softening at the Brookings Institution in early 2026. When the central bank is constrained from raising rates because that would increase debt service or trigger fiscal stress, inflation expectations may become unanchored. Households and firms may come to expect that inflation is the path of least resistance for managing high debts. That is not a warning from a fringe analyst. That is the former chair of the Federal Reserve, on the record, describing a scenario where persistent government debt prevents the central bank from protecting the purchasing power of ordinary American households. And Gallup's most recent survey confirmed that consumer inflation expectations are already anchored at 3.0% for the 3-year and 5-year horizon. Americans are no longer expecting prices to fall. They are pricing permanent inflation into their behavior right now. Here is where the trap hits the middle class most directly and most permanently: the housing market. Deloitte's Q1 2026 economic outlook contains one sentence that should be required reading for every American planning to buy a home. The 30-year fixed mortgage rate is not expected to fall below 5.8% before the end of 2030. Not this year, not next year, 2030. And Deloitte explains exactly why. A widening federal budget deficit discourages investors from accepting lower compensation for lending to the U.S. government. That fiscal risk premium elevates the 10-year Treasury yield. And the 10-year Treasury yield drives your mortgage rate, not the Fed's overnight rate. The Fed can cut its short-term rate and your mortgage rate barely moves because the debt has structurally severed that transmission channel. The practical consequence for a family buying a median-priced American home today at a 6.5% rate versus the 3.5% rate millions of Americans locked in between 2020 and 2022 is roughly $700 to $800 more per month in interest payments on the same property. That is $9,000 per year, every year, for 30 years, not going to equity, going to interest. Not Wall Street's problem, the problem of the family that saved the down payment, built the credit score, and did everything right. And it extends far beyond housing. A record 55% of Americans told Gallup that their financial situation is deteriorating. That is the 5th consecutive year of declining financial sentiment, lower than during the 2008 financial crisis, lower than during the 2020 pandemic. The Congressional Budget Office projects federal debt rising from roughly 100% of GDP today to 120% by 2036 and 175% by 2050. Economic research consistently shows that debt above 90% of GDP permanently reduces annual GDP growth by 1 to 1.5 percentage points. That slowdown translates directly into permanently lower wages, permanently slower job creation, and permanently higher borrowing costs for every American household. Japan ran this exact experiment. Its central bank subordinated monetary policy to fiscal necessity for over 2 decades. The result was persistent currency weakness, imported inflation, declining real wages for a generation, and a housing market that barely appreciated in real terms for 30 years. Japanese real wages peaked in the mid-1990s, not from a single dramatic crisis, from a quiet, persistent, grinding erosion of purchasing power that played out across an entire generation with no single moment to point to and say, that's when it happened. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budgets, Maya McGuinness, said it plainly. The debt squeezes our budgets with massive interest costs. It exposes us needlessly to challenges from geopolitical rivals. And without corrective action, rising debt could spark a devastating fiscal crisis. Here is the political reality that almost no analyst states loudly enough. Inflation is a regressive tax. It hits lower and middle-income households the hardest. Wealthy households hold assets, real estate, equities, businesses that inflate in nominal value alongside consumer prices. Middle-class households hold wages and savings, both of which are eroded by inflation in real terms. When inflation runs at 3.3% and wage growth runs at 3.0%, a middle-class household loses 0.3% of real purchasing power every year. Compounded over a decade, that is a 3% real wage cut with no announcement, no pink slip, and no explanation beyond, that's just how things are now. Both parties built this debt. Both parties cut the taxes and ran the deficits. The middle class didn't vote for fiscal dominance. The middle class is simply the demographic that lives inside its consequences. Powell said it will not end well. The IMF confirmed there is almost no room to cut. Deloitte said mortgage rates won't reach 5.8% until 2030. Yale quantified $16,000 to $36,000 in household wealth destruction per family from the current fiscal path. A record 55% of Americans say their financial situation is getting worse. This is already in your mortgage statement. It is already in your grocery cart. It is already in the gap between your last raise and the price increase that arrived before it. Drop a comment below right now. Tell me the single biggest financial pressure your household is facing today. That answer tells me everything about what this fiscal trap is actually doing to real American families. And if this analysis helped you understand why you feel like you're working harder while falling further behind, share this with someone who needs to hear it. It's not bad luck. It's fiscal dominance meeting the American middle class. If you want this level of analysis delivered to you daily, hit subscribe. It takes 1 second, and it might be the most valuable financial decision you make this week.